moving into our gospel for the day. Here we go. Coming from the 14th chapter of St. Luke. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of the leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. Now, when you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and then the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Any questions? So, humility. Yeah, humility. Got to talk about it every now and then. I'm remembering in 1980, I don't know how many of you were around 1980, but in 1980, there was a country western singer. His name was Mac Davis. And Mac was invited to be the headliner at one of the largest casinos and hotels at the time in Las Vegas. And he was invited to come and arrive 3 days early before, his show was starting. And not only that, but he was given what they called the Star Suite, kind of a penthouse, unbelievable. And they said, "Listen, you're the headliner, you're the star, here's your suite, and by the way, everything's on the house. Just anything you want to eat, drink, you can invite friends, whatever you want, it's all yours." So here's Mac, he's arrives a little bit early, he's got this suite, anything he wants, like all that, and he's feeling pretty good about himself. Got a ton of fans, just out there, "Mac, we love you." And so he wakes up the next morning and he's feeling good about himself, pretty good about himself. And with tongue-in-cheek, he begins to write this song, which became really popular. And in 1980, if you were hanging out at bars, which I know all of you were, this would have become somewhat of a theme song. It's kind of a sing-along theme song. "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror, because I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be a hell of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can." My daughter was over visiting yesterday afternoon. I was in the shop and I went in to chat with Sandy and Biz. And Biz said, "Hey, Padre," she calls me Padre, "what's the gospel on tomorrow?" And I said, "Humility." And she said, "Well, who are you going to get to preach on that?" My wife got a big chuckle. I remember, families make you humble. They do. families make you humble. Yeah, I'm remembering, this is a long time ago. I'm not sure how old Biz was, 7 or 8 or something like that. And, we're driving through St. Helena. I'm not exactly sure, but she was sitting in the back seat. And, somebody pulled some kind of a bonehead move, in front of me. I don't know what it was, but, out of my mouth came this invective, not to the glory of the mental caliber of the person who was driving the car. And I'm going on and on. There might have been a gesture involved. And I'm going on and on and on. And finally, I hear this little voice from the back seat say, "Another kind word from your local Episcopal priest." I'm remembering one Sunday, this is a long time ago, it was 8 o'clock, and there was a young man that brought his son, and his son might have been, 5 or 6, something like that. I'd never seen him before, he or his boy, and they came to church at 8 o'clock, and, I was going on, and at the time of the Eucharist, this fellow came forward with his little boy. And he's at the altar, and I'm there, and I had a chasuble on, the vestment on the outside, looking pretty pious, looking pretty holy. And I'm going down the, altar rail, the body of Christ, and all that kind of stuff. And this little kid was just bug-eyed. And, his dad showed him how to put out a little hand like that. And he looked at me, and his eyes were real big, and he said, "Are you God?" And I said, "No, I'm not God, but I have a cookie from God." And I gave him the wafer, and I kept on going. And after the service, the chalice bearer was a good friend of mine. Her name was Jan Bradley. The chalice bearer that day were in the sacristy after the service, and she said, "What do you do with stuff like that? People say nice things about you and put you on a pedestal, and here's this little kid, he thinks you might be God." She said, "What do you do with all that?" I said, "I go home. I go home." One of the things, you probably noticed it by now, I've said it in that prayer every Sunday for our country. One of the things that we pray that we will not be is proud. Save us from pride, arrogance, and every evil way. That's kind of harkens back to a bygone era, doesn't it? I mean, civility has completely left the public forum. Pure manners, common decency, they're just gone. They're just gone. I remember I went to a boarding school when I was 13 years old, came out of a public school system, went to boarding school. And in boarding school, the class, all the students would be in the classroom, and there would be some, chit-chat, whatever, And then a bell would ring, and the professor, the teacher would then, at that point, come into the classroom. And at that point, everybody would stand. Everybody would stand. And that was for every class that you attended. And if on occasion a faculty member or an elder happened to come into the classroom, everyone stood. Everyone stood. That's not the case anymore. It's not the case anymore. I think respect for elders, gone. Gone. Respect for educators, gone. Just mutual respect around, gone. One of my favorite contemporary authors is David Brooks. All of you know that David Brooks taught a course on humility at Yale for 3 years, after which he wrote a book called The Road to Character. If you haven't read the book, I commend it highly. It's a great book about different individuals that reflected a moral ethos that we no longer have in the common dialogue. And in the introduction to the book, he tells a very interesting story. That he's driving home, and on his little radio, he's listening to this radio show. It's called Command Performance. And these are snippets from radio programs in the past. And the one that he's listening to on this particular day was an address on August 15th, 1945, which all of you know was the day after D-Day, when the Second World War ended. And here is Cary Grant and Betty Davis, Marlene Dietrich, all these celebrities reflecting on the victory that had been won in World War II. And he said there was no chest beating, there was no, we won! There was nothing like that. It was mostly how grateful they were for the sacrifice that had been made. And that finally this darkness had been defeated. And so he's listening to this show on the radio, and he gets home, and it's a Sunday, and playing on the television at home is a football game. And he sees on the thing, he sees a football player that runs a yard. Apparently it was an important yard. And this fellow gets up, the runner gets up and does this victory dance. You know, yay me. And he said, you know, what struck me is that there was more self-celebration in a football player running a yard than there was in these people who were celebrating the end of World War II. David Brooks. It did occur to me as I watched that football player dance that there was a strain of humility that was more common then than now. There was a moral ecology stretching back centuries, but less prominent now, that encouraged people to be more skeptical of their desires, more aware of their own weaknesses, more intent on combating the flows of their own natures and turning weaknesses into strengths. People in this tradition, I thought, are less likely to feel that every thought, every feeling, and every achievement that they had should be immediately shared with the world at large. What's happened? Where did we go so wrong? The virtue of humility. I mean, it's so far from anything contemporary, of anything that's being mentioned or whatever. So when it comes to humility, really, you know, in church circles, in Christian circles, you know, we look for, you know, the bright lights and so forth, you know, what really shines forth for us. And always as Christians, we look to Jesus, about whom Paul said, you know, he didn't equate equality with God something to be proud of. He humbled himself, even to death on a cross. So humility, you know, emerges in the language of Christianity very early on. So what is it? How can we define it? What would help us to understand it more deeply and to make every effort to integrate it into our lives? Humility? I don't know. So in most areas of our lives, like if in your profession you look to those that have gone before and what they've said, and always in Christianity, I think it's good every now and then to look to the monks, to look to the nuns, to look to those that have said, hey, I'm cashing out, I'm going to go for Jesus, I'm all in. I'm all in. And some of the earliest ones were in the earliest century of the church. They just said, you know, we're going to go out into the desert where no one's going to really get to us very much, and we're just going to be whoever Jesus wants us to be. And one of the first people who really did that and wrote about it was a guy named Saint Benedict. Benedict, wealthy guy, sold by a wealthy family, sent to Rome for education. And when he was in Rome, he said, these people have gone crazy. I mean, there was just no moral fiber whatsoever. And the entire empire was about to drop to the heathens. And Benedict said, I'm out of here. I am out of here. And he went to a cave in a place called Subiaco for 3 years. In a cave. And they lowered food. They lowered food on a rope. Local people. And he came out of the cave, and apparently Ben, it changed him. It changed him. And, you know, people had known Ben before, said, Ben, what in the hell happened to you? And he said, well, you know, I just sat in the cave, and here's what happened. And they said, Ben, whatever you want, I don't know what it is, but whatever you want, I want it too. Would you mind, Ben? Would you mind, Ben, if I moved in? We could hang together and maybe what you have would rub. And Ben said, okay. And there you have your first monastery. And there were others that said, whatever you have, we want. And so Ben now has the reputation of being the father of Western monasticism. Who's heard of the Benedictines? They're all over the planet. They're all over the planet. Men, women, in monasteries, living out the gospel. So here you have this little book. There's a little this particular book having to be published in 1980. It's called The Rule of Saint Benedict. It is probably the smallest and most powerful book in the history of the Christianity. This is a book that was authored by Saint Benedict as a result of his starting 13 monasteries in Italy. And he said, you know, people need some guidelines. People need some guidelines. It is also one of the most boring documents in Christianity, but it's got some jewels in it. It's got some jewels in it. I like this particular one because I was on retreat at St. John's College in Collegeville, Minnesota. Probably not a lot of you know that. It's one of the largest Benedictine monasteries in the country, and there's a college there, St. John's College. Very remote. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It's beautiful. Beautiful lake. I mean, the environment is fantastic. Huge monastery, huge. When in its heyday, I'm not sure how many hundreds of monks actually were at St. John's. But you'll remember in the 60s and 70s, there was a thing called Vatican II. How many remember Vatican II? When the Roman Church came together and said, we have fallen behind, kids. We got to get our act together. And so all these priests and bishops and thinkers and theologians came together and they said, what do we need to do? What do we need to change? And one of the things that they needed to change, which made a lot of people angry, is language in the vernacular. In other words, for the first time, people in the United States were able to hear the Mass in a language that they could understand. I remember as a kid going to church with my friends who were Catholics and saying, what in the hell did that guy just say? I didn't understand the language. Well, that's Latin and blah, blah, blah. So that changed all that. You don't think people got angry? The church is still trying to adjust, almost as much as we're trying to adjust to this new prayer book. Because change, ouch, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, Collegeville, Minnesota, where this monastery is, St. John's, they were all ready for Vatican II. They had the publishing house, the printing presses were cranked up, and they were ready. They had all the liturgical scholars from around the world come to St. John's to think and hammer out these documents that would now be made available to Western Christians. They were poised. They made a lot of money, they made a lot of fame, but it really put them on the map. And to this day, the events that happen in Collegeville are determining for Roman Catholics. But I'm robbing a treat there. I go into the used library. I can't afford a new book. I go into the used library, and I find this little book called The Rule of St. Benedict. I didn't have one. I knew what it was, but I didn't have one. And I'm going through these little books. There was a number of them. And I like this one because it's all underlined. And I like to imagine that there was an aspiring monk, some guy who's given it some thought. And he's reading through the rule, and he's kind of making notes of things that are important to him. So it's kind of a precious little document. But you can listen to, and I have been, again, all week long to the University of YouTube. And I just searched for Benedictine spirituality. And it's amazing what's out there. But there are all these monks and nuns, some of whom you're familiar with, maybe not all, weighing in on Benedictine spirituality, right at the heart of which humility. Humility. Without humility, you can't live together. You know, if you're going to live in proximity with people, they're people. They're going to get way, way under your skin. So, no talking. No talking. No talking. And then just assume that everybody else is better and knows more than you do. That's a basic assumption, especially your abbot. And if you don't want to wash the bathroom that day and the abbot says to wash it, wash it. I don't care if you like it. You have to be obedient. You have to be obedient in life to live properly. And so, you know, there's this whole chapter. It's called Chapter 7. And you've heard of 12 steps. He lays out the 12 steps of humility. Here's how it works. It's like a ladder. It's like Jacob's ladder. There's a ladder that goes up, and there's a ladder that goes down. And the way to go up is to go down. The more humble you'll get, the more higher you'll go. The higher you think you're going, the lower you actually are. It's all discombobulated because that's the way it works. That's the way it works. Those who are humbled will be exalted, just like Jesus said, talking to that leader of the Pharisee. Here's how it works. Don't invite your friends. Don't invite people you expect to pay you back and invite you to dinner. No, invite the people who never get invited. That's what the whole enterprise is about. Care for people more than yourself. More than yourself. Be humble. And the famous line, of course, by the theologian C.S. Lewis, what did he say? Humility is not thinking less of yourself, I'm such a bonehead, which is true. It's thinking of yourself less. Thinking of yourself less and thinking especially of God more. Here's the hierarchy. God, me. All the time. Every decision, every action, and especially every relationship. And then things will go better. Things will go better because you're not going to get your way. You're not. You're not. If you want it too much, it's only going to lead to heartbreak and disappointment. So the less you talk, the more obedient you are, the happier you'll probably wind up being. So, Benedict, the wisdom coming out of his experience was, okay, we work. We do work. Every Benedictine monastery has to be self-sustaining. They make good wine. They make great honey. Sometimes they make cookies. Sometimes they make bread. They make whatever they do, but they're financially sustained by the work that they do in the monastery. And I remember I was at the monastery down south, the Camaldoli Monastery down south, and I'm sitting there and I'm chatting with the abbot. We're having this great conversation about God and life and everything, and all of a sudden he looks at his watch and bolts up and he said, I got to make the announcements. And he goes up and he rings this bell and he says, okay, Ed, you're doing toilets. Joe, you're washing dishes. Fred, you're out on the front steps with a broom. And he's all these assignments. And you know what? Not a one of those monks said, I don't feel like it today. And that's how the monastery works, and that's why it works. And that's why it's been the bedrock of Christianity for 1,500 years. They get it. And what's the reward? Peace of mind, presence of God, an encounter with the sacred in their serving. Brief snippet. I'm not going to bore you with too much of the rule. Brief snippet. Chapter 72. And this is getting to the end of the book. It's called the Good Zeal. The Good Zeal, the passion of monks. Just as there is a wicked zeal of bitterness, which separates from God and leads to hell, so there is a good zeal, which separates from evil and leads to God and everlasting life. This, then, is the good zeal which monks must foster with fervent love. They should each try to be the first to show respect to the other, supporting with the greatest patience one another's weaknesses of body or behavior, and earnestly competing in obedience to one another. What a concept! What a concept! No one is to pursue what he or she judges better for himself, but instead what he or she judges better for someone else. To their fellow monks, they show the pure love of brothers, to God, loving fear, to their abbot, unfeigned and humble love. Let them prefer nothing whatever to Christ, and may Christ bring us all together to everlasting life. Pretty good, Ben. Pretty good. So in closing, I want to repeat the collect that was read for us this morning by York. It's good. And then I'm going to give you a few minutes of silence just to be. Dear Lord, we pray for a different world, one that covets peace and where kindness and consideration enable all to truly coexist. Help us to live according to thy will, with strength in faith, love-filled courage, a penchant for humility, and unending grace. Grant that we, in the midst of growing strife and injustice within humanity, serve as beacons of fellowship and unity, illuminating the hearts of our community with benevolence and a kindred spirit, reminding all that no matter how diverse our world is, it is only through love that we can become one. For we are all children, branches of thy vine, in the steps of Jesus, whose walk and teachings have shown the way, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever.
Contributions to St. Luke's Episcopal Church help to make the digital ministry and other outreach within the community possible. If it is in your heart to make a donation, St. Luke's secure PayPal link, as well as the church's mailing information, may be found in the description of this video. Thank you.